September 28th, 1945. The ruins of Hiroshima Prefecture. The demons had returned. They came not from the sky this time, but from the sea, their landing craft disgorging onto the shattered coastline. 19-year-old Etsuko Tanaka, who had lost her family beneath a collapsing roof 53 days prior, watched them from the relative safety of a makeshift lean-to. She watched them for 3 days. 3 days of trucks grinding radioactive dust into the earth. 3 days of shouted commands in a language she associated only with the voice from the radio, announcing the end of everything. 3 days trying to understand. Nobody believed it. But the evidence was overwhelming. Rumors moved faster than the relief convoys. Whispers in the breadlines. Hushed theories exchanged over meager bowls of watery soup. Someone said they were a survey team, here to map the atomic desert for a military textbook. A folder was allegedly being compiled in Manila. The folder was called Anatomy of a Dead City. Others, shivering in the unseasonably cold nights, swore they were here to finish the job. A second strike, maybe a chemical agent to sterilize the land and its few remaining inhabitants. They were here to erase the evidence, to erase the survivors. The hibakusha, the living ghosts. But on the fourth day, something changed. The Americans did not carry rifles. They carried hammers, shovels, and spools of copper wire. Shigeo Nakamura, a 40-year-old former city planner who now spent his days sifting rubble for salvageable bricks, saw them unrolling blueprints near the ghost of the Aioi Bridge, the original target. He expected to see plans for a barracks, an occupation headquarters. Instead, his trained eye recognized the schematics for a water purification plant. He saw grids for a new electrical system, detailed down to the transformer placements. They spoke not of surrender terms, but of load-bearing walls and soil stability. One of them, a young lieutenant with blonde hair, tried to ask him a question, pointing at the shattered ground and then at the paper, his face a mask of earnest confusion. The Germans expected American barbarism. They found American abundance. The Japanese survivors of Hiroshima expected a final, cruel judgment. They found civil engineers. They came as enemies. They were now behaving like city contractors. The men whose comrades had unleashed the Picadon, the flashbang that vaporized 70,000 souls in an instant, were now debating the merits of pre-stressed concrete for building schools. It was an act so profoundly illogical, so contrary to the laws of war and revenge. It constituted a second psychological bombing of the city. Why? Why would the arsonist return to the ashes with a bucket of water and a blueprint for a fire station? A classified directive from the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, codenamed Olympic Rebirth, offered a sterile political explanation focused on winning hearts and minds. Maybe from the command ships, maybe straight from Washington. But the real answer, a complex story of shock, national guilt, and a bizarre, unprecedented form of penance, was never filed away. It was buried in the stunned silence of the survivors who now had to decide if they could or should accept help from the Sky Devils themselves. This investigation uncovers that unwritten history, pieced together from forgotten diaries, declassified military reports, and the raw, unvarnished testimony of the last few who remember the day the destroyers came back to build. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, Japan, 8:15 in the morning. There was no sound, only light. A pica, a flash so brilliant it bleached the world white. A sun bloomed over the city where no sun should be. A silent, violent, impossible sun. For an instant, every shadow, every person, every leaf was etched onto the world in stark black relief. Then the world caught fire. Then it was gone. Akiko Takakura was 19 years old, a clerk at the Bank of Hiroshima, just 300 meters from the place they would later call the Hypocenter. She remembered the world turning a blinding yellow, then blackness. She was buried in the rubble of the bank, the weight of the city pressing down, the air thick with dust and the sudden, shocking silence of a million sounds stopping all at once. She was alive. A miracle. but she had been saved for hell. That's how it began. When she crawled out, the city was gone. Simply gone. The air, once a clear summer morning, was a thick brown twilight, heavy with the dust of 760,000 tons of vaporized buildings. Wood, paper, tile, stone, flesh, all consumed by a heat that had reached thousands of degrees Celsius at its core. Fires raged everywhere, merging into a single monstrous entity. A firestorm. It sucked the very air from the streets, creating a hurricane of flame. A city of paper houses. A city built to burn. It was burning. Akiko saw them then. The ghosts. A procession of them stumbling from the ruins toward the rivers. They moved in single file, their arms outstretched to avoid the agony of touching their own scorched bodies. They were naked, their clothes burned away by the flash. Their skin hung in long, dark strips, like rags, like old wallpaper peeling from a damp wall. Some had their eyeballs melted, hanging down their cheeks. Others had the patterns of their kimonos, flowers, stripes, leaves, seared directly onto their skin. A permanent photograph of their last normal moment. They did not cry. They did not scream. They just walked, a silent parade of the damned. Someone whispered they looked like ants. Ants fleeing a disturbed nest. At the Red Cross Hospital, 1.6 kilometers from the center, Dr. Terafumi Sasaki was one of the lucky ones. He had been standing in a corridor, shielded by the building's concrete walls. He was unhurt. The hospital stood. But it was no longer a hospital, it was an abattoir. The wounded came, and came, and came. 6,000, then maybe 10,000 people, pouring into a facility with a capacity for a few hundred. There were no supplies, no bandages, no medicine, no clean water, no beds. Only the dying. A doctor's log, scribbled in haste, noted the injuries. Flash burns covering 100% of the body, glass shards embedded in every inch of flesh, crushed limbs, ruptured organs, blinded eyes. Sasaki worked for 3 days without sleep. He worked until his hands were slick with blood, and his mind was numb. He was just one man against an ocean of pain. And then the main thing started, a new kind of sickness. It began a few days later. People who had seemed fine, people with only minor injuries, people who had been kilometers away, started to die. It began with a crushing fatigue, nausea, a high fever that would not break. Then came the spots. Purple spots, like tiny bruises, that appeared all over the body. Petechiae. Their gums would bleed, their hair would fall out in clumps, their vomit was filled with blood. The doctors had no name for it. The reports called it the new sickness. Rumors flew through the makeshift shelters. It was a poison gas the Americans had mixed into the bomb. It was a miasma rising from the burned earth. It was a curse nobody knew. But the whispers were there. It was a new kind of death. A silent killer. This death came from the inside out. It unmade the body cell by cell. On the 9th of August, a black rain fell. A sticky, greasy, radioactive rain, thick with ash and soot from the cremated city. The survivors, mad with thirst, cupped their hands and drank it. They drank the poison. They drank their own slow death. The military men kept quiet. Their internal reports mentioned a new phrase, one translated from the enemy's broadcasts. A Genshi Bakudan, an atomic bomb. The words meant nothing. The reality was the smell. The sweet, cloying smell of burning bodies that hung over the 7 rivers of Hiroshima. A smell that would cling to the survivors for the rest of their lives. Years passed. 1950, 1955. The city was rebuilt. Concrete, steel, and glass rose from the ash. A new Hiroshima. A city of peace. But the bomb's work was not finished. It was patient. The sickness returned, but in a new form. Leukemia, a cancer of the blood. It took the children first, the ones who had been infants or in the womb on that day. Sadako Sasaki, no relation to the doctor, was just 2 years old when the bomb fell. She seemed perfectly healthy, a runner. At age 12, the diagnosis came: leukemia. 1,000 paper cranes for a wish. 1,000 cranes for a life. Then came the other cancers: stomach, thyroid, lung, breast, a lottery of suffering. The bomb's invisible particles lodged in bone and tissue were still firing, still killing. The survivors carried the keloids, thick, rubbery, worm-like scars that grew over their burns, a permanent brand marking them as hibakusha, people of the bomb. But they carried worse things inside: the fear. Every fever, every headache, every unexplained pain. Was this it? Was the bomb, after all these years, finally coming for them? The American reports, the files from the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, were filled with charts, data, and cold, hard numbers. Numbers are always truthful, but they do not tell the truth. Akiko Takakura survived. She lived a long life, but she never forgot the ant-like procession. She never forgot the silence. The American survey teams came in September. They brought with them strange metal boxes on wands, Geiger counters, instruments of cold, hard science. They walked through the ruins of the city, through the new barracks, through the hospitals. And the boxes clicked. They clicked over the black dirt. They clicked over the water of the Oda River. They clicked over the bones that still lay in the rubble. They held the wands over the living, over the survivors. The boxes clicked faster. A frantic, chattering sound. It was the sound of the poison. The sound of a clock that had been started at 8:15 in the morning on August 6th. A clock that was still ticking. And nobody, not the Americans with their machines, not the Japanese with their dead, knew how or when it would ever stop. October 12th, 1951. St. Luke's Hospital, San Francisco. The man did not speak. He had not spoken in 3 years. His name was Kaito Tanaka, age 32, a former clerk from Hiroshima. He sat in a chair, his hands perfectly still on his knees, staring at a wall painted a sterile, hopeful beige. But he wasn't in the room. He was 6 years in the past under a sky that had turned to fire. The doctors called it catatonic shock, a deep withdrawal. They had a file for him. The file was labeled A-bomb neurosis, a term as new and clumsy as the weapon that had created it. Nobody knew what to do. The physical scars, the keloids, the radiation sickness, those were horrors you could see. You could measure them, photograph them. But this was different. This was a ghost sickness, an invisible poison that seeped into the mind. The survivors carried it with them, a secret radiation of the soul. They were called hibakusha, explosion-affected people. A label whispered in the street, a mark of contamination. Employers turned them away. Neighbors shunned their children. Potential spouses vanished. They said the madness was catching. They said the bad luck would spread, so the survivors learned to be silent. A profound, stoic silence that was louder than any scream. It was a shield and a cage. The silence was a symptom. The American doctors, men from the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, noted it in their reports. Subject displays extreme reticence, one entry read, stoicism bordering on the pathological. They didn't understand. They saw it as a cultural trait, a Japanese peculiarity. They missed the terror underneath, the terror of being different, the terror of being known, the terror of the memory itself. To speak of it was to make it real again. And it was already too real. It was in their blood, their bones, their dreams. The dreams were the worst. They were not dreams of the great flash, the Pika. The mind blocked that out. Too big, too final. The dreams were of the small things that came after. The search for a child in a landscape of rubble and shadows. The thirst. The endless, agonizing thirst. The black rain that fell, staining the skin, promising relief but delivering poison. The voices calling for water, growing fainter and fainter until they stopped. One by one, a chorus of the dead. These were the demons that came in the night. Sleep was not a refuge, it was a return. Then, slowly, a change. It began in small rooms, in church basements and community halls, far from the clinical gaze of the commission doctors. A Quaker missionary, a man named Marcus Thorne, started a group, not for study, for testimony. He asked them to just sit, to be together in their silence. For weeks they did just that. 10, then 20 survivors, sitting in a circle of shared, unspoken dread. The air was thick with it, palpable. One evening, a woman named Chio Watanabe, a 50-year-old mother who had lost her husband and 2 sons, began to weep. It was a low, quiet sound at first, a broken hum. Then it grew, a wave of grief held back for 6 years, a sound of pure, undiluted loss that filled the room and broke the spell of silence. She spoke. She spoke of the schoolyard, of the small, charred lunchbox she found with her son's name Kenji, scratched into the lid. She described it in meticulous detail. The scorched rice, the melted clasp, the faint smell of him that she imagined was still there. She spoke for an hour. Nobody interrupted. When she finished, the room was different. A crack had appeared in the wall of silence. That's how it began. The stories started to come out. Not all at once, in fragments. A sentence here, a single word there. They were not grand narratives of survival. They were mosaics of horror. A man spoke of the river, of the naked, burned bodies floating motionlessly, their arms outstretched as if in prayer. A young woman whispered about her own hair, how it came out in clumps in her hands a week later. The feel of her smooth, bare scalp, the shame, the lists of sensory details, a litany of the damned. The buzzing of a million flies, the sweet, sickly smell of burning flesh, the crunch of glass and bone underfoot, the taste of ash in the mouth. Always the taste of ash. Not everyone could speak. For some, the words would not form. A former artist, Ichiro Sato, brought drawings. Charcoal on cheap paper. They were not pictures of the mushroom cloud. They were pictures of what he saw inside. Faces with no mouths. Bodies that were only shadows. A sketch of a single abandoned tricycle, its one remaining wheel spinning slowly in a silent wind. His testimony was in the stark black lines, a visual scream from a throat that could no longer make a sound. The doctors had a name for it: selective mutism. Ichiro called it Tuesday. The process was not healing, not yet. It was an excavation, a lancing. Each story told was a piece of shrapnel being pulled from a wound. The pain was immense, but for the first time it was a shared pain. The fear of discrimination remained. The fear of the memories never left. But the isolation, the terrible, crushing weight of being the only one, that began to lift. A little. They were not just Hibakusha. They were Kaido, Chio, Ichiro. They had names. They had stories. Back in St. Luke's Hospital, a young psychiatrist, a student of Marcus Thorne, sat with Kato Tanaka. He did not ask questions. He did not run tests. He sat. He waited. For months. He simply bore witness to the silence. One afternoon, as the San Francisco fog rolled in past the window, Kaido Tanaka's lips moved. A dry, rasping sound emerged, the first in years. It was not a sentence, it was a single word, a name. Hana, his sister's name, the one he had been searching for when the world ended. The word hung in the sterile air of the room, an impossibly fragile thing. A beginning, or perhaps the beginning of a beginning. The ghost in the machine was stirring, and the main thing had just started. December 3rd, 1945. Kure Naval Base, Hiroshima Prefecture. They were called the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, ABCC. It sounded like help. It was not help. The men who came ashore were doctors, scientists, statisticians. They arrived in crisp uniforms and polished shoes that crunched on the debris-strewn docks. They carried clipboards, sample vials, measuring tapes. They came to study the effects of the bomb, not to cure them. An important distinction, a brutal distinction. They were there to observe, to record, to measure the half-life of a dying city. The Americans had created a new kind of death. Now they wanted to watch it work. For the survivors, the Hibakusha, it was a new violation. First, their bodies were torn apart by a sun made on Earth. Now their suffering was to be catalogued, their blood taken, their wounds photographed, their children measured. For science, they whispered about it in the shacks built from scorched timbers and corrugated iron. The white-coated doctors would come. They would ask questions, point to charts. They would take and take and take, but they would not give. No medicine, no treatment, not a single aspirin. The official report said this was to keep the data pure, uncontaminated by variables. The people of Hiroshima had another word for it: cruelty. But then came the others. They did not arrive on military vessels. They came on freighters, their names painted over, their manifests filled with strange cargo. They were a different kind of American. January 11th, 1947. Ujina Port, Hiroshima. A man stepped onto the pier. He was not a soldier, not a scientist. His name was Floyd Schmo, a forestry professor from Seattle. A Quaker, a pacifist. He was 61 years old, with kind eyes and hands accustomed to working with wood. He did not carry a clipboard. He carried a hammer. Behind him, on the ship, were not vials and microscopes. There was lumber. Douglas fir, cedar, redwood. There were kegs of nails, boxes of window panes, rolls of roofing paper. All shipped from America. A strange kind of penance. A strange kind of hope. Nobody believed him. At first, an American building houses. For free? In the city his country had vaporized? The idea was insane. A trick. Some new, elaborate way to study them. Schmo and his small team of volunteers, Americans and Japanese Americans, set up in a ruined temple. They called their project Houses for Hiroshima, a simple name. A radical idea. They asked for nothing. They only wanted to build. For the widows, the orphans, the ones left with nothing but the shadow of a memory. He met with the mayor, Shinzo Hamai. He showed him the blueprints, small houses, simple, sturdy wooden houses, houses to keep out the rain. The first plot of land was in the Iba district, a wasteland of rubble and weeds, haunted by the ghosts of 1,000 homes. The volunteers began to clear the debris, piece by piece, brick by brick. They dug foundations in the poisoned earth. The local people watched, from a distance. Their faces were blank masks, hiding suspicion, hiding grief, hiding a fragile, terrifying flicker of something else. Then it happened. An old man, Ichiro Sato, had been a master carpenter before the Pika. Before the flash that took his workshop, his wife, his son. He had watched the Americans for 3 days, his one good hand clenched and unclenched. On the 4th day, he walked onto the site. He said nothing. He simply picked up a saw. An American volunteer, a young man named Paul, a conscientious objector from Oregon, stopped working. He watched the old man. Sato's movements were slow, stiff, but precise. He made a perfect cut through a plank of Douglas fir, a cut born of 50 years of practice. He laid the saw down and looked at the American. The silence was absolute. It was a question. It was an answer. That's how it began. Soon others came. A plasterer who had lost an eye. A roofer with a burn-scarred back. Women who brought tea and rice balls. Children who sorted nails into rusty cans. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, working alongside Sato, Tanaka, Yamamoto. They did not share a language. They did not need one. The rhythmic percussion of hammers, the rasp of saws, the scrape of trowels became their conversation. A language of creation in a place defined by destruction. A language of work, of sweat, of building something new where everything old had been annihilated. 1 house, then 2, then 10. A whole street began to emerge from the mud and ash of Iba. They called it the Peace Village. Each house was small, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it had walls, a roof, a window to let in the light. For families living in tunnels and tin shacks, it was a palace. It was a miracle. The rebuilding was more than wood and nails. It was a ritual. For the Americans, it was an act of atonement, a desperate need to mend what their country had broken. For the Japanese, it was an act of defiance, a refusal to remain victims, to take the tools offered by the enemy and use them to rebuild their own lives, on their own terms. Challenges remained. Of course they did. There were moments of raw, unspoken tension. An American would laugh too loudly and a sudden, cold silence would fall over the worksite. A Japanese worker would stare at the sky, his eyes vacant, and the Americans would look away ashamed. The bomb was always there, the ghost at the feast. The unexploded ordnance buried deep in the city's heart. One evening, in the late autumn of 1948, Floyd Schmo was inspecting a newly finished house. The family had just moved in. A woman, Mrs. Sasaki, and her 2 small children. Her husband was gone. August 6th. She bowed low to Schmo, tears in her eyes, and offered him a cup of tea. As he sat on the new tatami mat, the smell of fresh cedar filling the small room, a jeep pulled up outside. An American Army jeep. 2 men in uniform got out. They were not builders, they carried clipboards. They were from the ABCC, they knocked on the doorframe. They were polite, efficient. They had come for a scheduled observation. They needed to take a blood sample from the 7-year-old boy, Kenji. For Project 47, a new long-term study. A study of the children of the survivors. Mrs. Sasaki's face went pale. She clutched her son's hand. The boy looked from his mother's terrified face to the smiling American doctor with the needle. Floyd Schmo stood up. He stood between the doctors and the family. In the house he had built. The house made of American wood and Japanese hope. The air grew thick, heavy. The doctor's smile faltered. He looked at the old Quaker, then at the file in his hand. The file was thick. It was just the beginning. The report stated its objective clearly: to observe, not to treat, to track the genetic damage, the long, slow decay. To watch what would happen to the children who grew up in the rebuilt city. August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima First Municipal Girls' School. The building was gone. In its place, a tomb of splintered wood and broken roof tiles. Underneath it all, a voice. Faint. So faint. A 13-year-old girl was trapped, buried alive in the wreckage of her own school. Her name was Setsuko Nakamura. Darkness. Absolute. The smell of burning pine, of scorching flesh, filled her lungs. Dust choked her. She was one of about 30 students, all mobilized for the war effort, all tasked with decoding secret messages. The message that morning had been light. Pure, silent, blinding light. Then the world had collapsed. She could hear her classmates crying for their mothers, whispering prayers. Then, one by one, the whispers stopped. Silence. A man's voice cut through the dark. "Don't give up. Keep moving. I am trying to free you." A hand grabbed her shoulder, pulled her. She was dragged from the rubble into a nightmare landscape. The sun was a dark, bloody orb. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. She was a survivor, one of only 2 from her group. That's how it began. Not with a choice, but with a pull from the darkness. They were called Hibakusha, bomb-affected people, a name that should have been a mark of survival. Instead, it became a brand of shame, a secret. Rumors spread like radiation. They were contagious. Their children would be deformed. They could not find work. They could not find spouses. So they hid their scars. They hid their stories. The American occupation authorities, the men from the ABCC, forbade any publication, any film, any discussion of the bomb's effects. It was classified, top secret. The Japanese government, desperate to rebuild, to appease their new masters, agreed. Silence. A conspiracy of silence that lasted for years, a national gag order, but some refused to be silent. Setsuko Nakamura became Setsuko Thurlow. She married a Canadian. In 1954, she moved to the United States for her studies. Lynchburg College, Virginia, a world away from the ruins, a world of blissful, terrifying ignorance. People asked questions, not out of malice, out of a deep, profound lack of knowing. They asked if Japan had electricity. They asked if she glowed in the dark. A real question, asked with a straight face. She realized then that the bomb did not just destroy a city. It destroyed understanding. It destroyed truth. So she started to speak. Her first speech was at a local church. Her hands trembled. Her voice was small. She spoke of the light, the heat, the black rain. She spoke of her 4-year-old nephew, Eiji, how he became a small, charred bundle that she could no longer recognize, how he kept begging for water until he died. The audience was quiet. Some wept. They had never heard, they had never known. The official report spoke of military targets, of strategic victories, of a war brought to a swift conclusion. They did not speak of Eiji. Another voice rose from the ashes. Keiko Ogura, 8 years old on that day. She was at home less than 2.5 kilometers from the hypocenter. The blast threw her to the ground. She saw people walking like ghosts, their skin hanging off in ribbons. She saw the black rain fall, thick and oily, and she drank the poisoned water because she was so thirsty. Everyone was thirsty. Keiko stayed in Hiroshima. She watched the city grow back, a miracle of steel, concrete, and glass. A city desperate to forget. But she could not forget. The ghosts were always there, in the rustle of leaves in the Peace Park, in the faces of the tourists. In 1984, she founded Hiroshima Interpreters for Peace, a small group, a quiet rebellion against the silence. They would tell the story, in English, to anyone who would listen. The official story was one of resilience. Hers was one of warning. "We are not just telling sad stories," she would say. "We are trying to save your life." The fight was lonely. It was a fight against forgetting, a fight against apathy. While the world's great powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, built their arsenals, stacking nuclear warheads like firewood for a global winter, the survivors spoke. Their audiences were small. Church basements, university lecture halls, town squares. Their weapon was memory. Their ammunition was the truth of a single morning. A truth written in vaporized shadows on stone steps. The folder was called Testimony. But it was more than that. It was an indictment. It was a collection of thousands of stories. Stories of children searching for parents, of parents digging for children. Stories of keloid scars, of radiation sickness, of leukemia. The reports from the ABCC were cold, clinical, full of numbers, charts, data points. They measured radiation doses, cataloged organ damage, tracked cancer rates. The testimonies were different. They had names, they had faces, they had souls. Setsuko Thurlow became a force, a relentless, powerful voice that carried the weight of the dead. She traveled the world, London, Paris, Geneva, New York. She spoke to anyone, students, activists, politicians, diplomats. She stood before the United Nations, a small woman with white hair and an unwavering gaze. She held up a picture of her classmates, 35 girls. "All of them except myself were incinerated," she told the silent chamber. "Their bodies became a pile of carbonized, melted flesh." There was opposition. Of course there was opposition. The nuclear-armed states dismissed them. They were emotional. They were unscientific. They were living in the past. Nationalists in Japan sent her hate mail. They called her a traitor. They said she was shaming the country. "Forget Hiroshima," they wrote. "Look to the future." But she knew. She knew her past was the world's potential future, a future she was sworn to prevent. Whispers followed the ABCC researchers. rumors in the rebuilt tea houses of Hiroshima, that the data they collected, the thousands of bodies they examined, the organs they shipped back to America, it wasn't just for medical science. It was for war science, for calculating blast radiuses, for refining yields, for building better, more efficient bombs. The survivors were not just patients, they were a control group. Human guinea pigs in the world's most horrific experiment. The data from their suffering was a blueprint for the next war. And then the main thing started. A new movement began to stir. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. ICAN, a global coalition. And at its heart was Setsuko Thurlow. She was their spiritual leader, their living proof. She pushed them, inspired them, dared them to succeed. They drafted a treaty, a simple, radical document, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It would make the bombs illegal, utterly, completely. July 7th, 2017. United Nations Headquarters, New York City. The vote was called. The numbers flashed on the big screen. 122 nations in favor, 1 against, 1 abstention. The treaty passed, the chamber erupted. Diplomats hugged and cried. Setsuko was there, in the gallery. She was 85 years old. She wept. Not for her lost classmates, not for her nephew Eiji. She wept for a promise she had made to them in the ruins, a promise kept. That year, ICAN, with Setsuko as its face, won the Nobel Peace Prize. A victory. A monumental victory. But the great powers did not vote. The United States, Russia, China, Britain, France. They boycotted the negotiations. They called the treaty naive. Dangerous. They refused to sign. The men with the launch codes and the nuclear submarines and the bombers on permanent alert, they did not listen. Their arsenals remained, polished and ready. The owners of the world's 9 nuclear arsenals had never seen the walking ghosts. They had never tasted the black rain. The fight was not over. It had just entered a new, more desperate phase. What is the sound of an enemy offering a hammer? For Hiroshima, that sound arrived from the sea, not the sky. It came in the hands of the destroyers, now returned as builders. They offered tools, not fire. They offered sweat, not annihilation. The real story, however, remained hidden, between the lines of official reports, in the shared silence over a single cigarette, in the averted eyes of a survivor staring at a new beige wall where a human shadow used to be. History is not a straight line. It is a scar. Some scars are covered over, others are not. The city rose from its own ashes, a testament to an impossible collaboration. But what was truly built in the space between these men, between the vanquished and the victor? Was it a bridge of forgiveness? Or was it just a fragile truce with the ghosts of 1945? We are left with the silence and the echo of a question that hangs forever over the rebuilt streets.